I'm raising 2 girls on my own after my wife died, and I keep things simple because I don't have room for chaos. One of the most important ones is that there are no games about spirits, no trying to contact the dead. I explained it clearly without trying to scare them because I wanted them to listen, not panic. They always said they understood, and they looked serious when they said it, which is why I let my guard down more than I should have. That night felt normal at first, with both of them in their room and me finishing some work while listening to the house the way I always do. The silence lasted too long for a house with kids, but I ignored it, thinking they were just tired or focused on something quiet. Suddenly, someone knocked on my door, and when I opened it, both of them were standing too close together, holding on to each other. They looked so tense. "We need help." I followed them to their room without asking questions right away. The lights were on, the curtains were closed, and there was a sweet smell that didn't belong there, like something from the kitchen had been used and left out. On the floor, I saw the letters drawn in a circle and the cup placed over them, and I felt immediate frustration because I had always warned them about this. "I told you not to do this." Instead of defending themselves, one of them looked at the cup and spoke in a low voice. "Someone answered, but it wasn't Mom." They both looked toward the door at the same time, and neither of them smiled or tried to turn it into a joke. I stayed still for a moment, watching how they reacted instead of focusing on the game. They weren't trying to convince me of anything. They were waiting for something to happen again. Then we heard a voice from the hallway, low and clear, calling one of their names like someone standing just outside the room. It didn't drag the word or whispered. It said it in a normal tone that made it feel closer. I walked out right away and checked both sides of the hallway. There was no one there, and nothing looked out of place. When I came back, both of them were on the bed, sitting close together. "It does that when we stop." I told them it was probably something from outside or sound they misunderstood. I turned to leave, but one of them pointed at the wall without speaking, and I followed her hand slowly because she didn't lower her arm. The message wasn't there before. "Come back." The letters were thick and uneven, and when I touched them, I realized it was ketchup, which made me turn back to them with frustration because it looked like a joke taken too far. "You don't do this and then act scared." They both started at once, trying to explain they didn't write it, and their voices were breaking in a way that didn't match a prank. But I still wasn't ready to accept that. Later that night, I stayed awake with my door open, listening for anything that didn't belong, because even if I didn't believe them fully, I couldn't ignore what I had heard. The house stayed quiet for a long time, and then I heard steps in the hallway. The sound had weight behind it, and it moved in a controlled way that didn't match how my daughters walk. I stepped outside and followed the direction of the sound, and it stopped right outside their door, like whoever was there knew I was coming. I stood in front of their door listening, and there was no movement inside, not even the sound of shifting on the bed. The silence stretched long enough to make me hesitate before opening it. When I did, both of them were asleep, and I checked them closely to make sure they were not pretending. Their breathing was slow, and neither of them reacted when I got close. Then I looked at the wall again. "This time, stay." The message had changed, and I knew it wasn't there before because I had already seen the previous one clearly. I woke them up and asked who wrote it, and they both looked confused and scared in a way that didn't feel staged. One of them started crying quietly while the other kept shaking her head. "We didn't get up." I checked their hands and the floor, and there was nothing showing that they had moved recently, and that forced me to stop assuming and start paying attention. In the hallway, I noticed a small red mark on the floor near the door, and when I crouched down, I saw that it matched the color on the wall. It wasn't a spill. It looked like something had been touched and lifted. I followed the marks slowly, keeping my eyes on the floor, and they led away from their bedroom toward mine. I moved carefully, not rushing, because the pattern was clear enough to follow, and the marks stopped at my door. When I opened it, I already knew something would be there. "Marry me." The message was larger this time, and it didn't match anything my daughters could write, which made it clear that something else was involved. I stayed in the room trying to understand how someone could move through the house without being seen, and I went through every possible explanation I could think of, but none of them worked. Then I heard a small movement behind me. I turned slowly and saw him standing in the corner. He was thin, older, wearing my wife's dress in a way that didn't fit his body, and he held an axe in both hands. His face was calm like he had been waiting. She didn't answer, so I did. I stepped back, keeping distance between us, and tried to position myself closer to the door. "Leave now." He smiled slightly and adjusted his grip on the axe. "They asked for someone, and I stayed." He moved forward and raised the axe, and I pushed past him, hitting his arm to throw off the swing. The blade struck the wall behind me with a heavy sound that carried through the house. I ran into the hallway and called for my daughters, not trying to stay quiet anymore. I heard him coming behind me, faster now, and I reached their room and opened the door. One of them was gone. The other pointed toward the hallway. He took her. I grabbed her arm and pulled her with me. He approached at the end of the hallway holding my other daughter by the arm, and she wasn't fighting him. She was looking at him like she knew him. She wanted me to stay. Then he turned and ran. I chased him through the house, following the sounds of his footsteps as he moved toward the back. He reached the wall near the storage area and pressed against it, and a hidden panel opened. He went inside with her, and I reached it seconds later, forcing it open with both hands. The space behind it was narrow and dark, and the air smelled like someone had been there for a long time. The passage opened into a small hidden room filled with things taken from the house, including food, clothes, and objects that had gone missing. There was another exit, and it was open. I called the police and explained everything as clearly as I could. They arrived quickly and searched the house, the walls, and the area around it. They found signs that he had been living inside the structure for weeks. They identified him as Daniel LaPlante. They found my daughter later that night, sitting outside a store, eating ice cream, while he stayed nearby talking to her like nothing had happened. She didn't look scared. They arrested him without resistance. He's in prison now, and they told me about other cases connected to him, about houses he entered and people he watched before acting. They explained his behavior, but it didn't change what happened in my house. My daughter still talks about him sometimes, and the way she describes him doesn't match what I saw. Because she says he was patient and that he listened to her when she spoke. That part is what stays with me, because it means he wasn't just hiding. He was building trust over time. Daniel LaPlante was known for a series of disturbing crimes in the 1980s that combined stalking, home invasion, and psychological manipulation. As a teenager, he secretly lived inside the walls of a family's house, watching them for weeks and moving through hidden spaces without being detected. He used this access to intimidate and control his victims, creating fear through strange messages and appearances.
I was not the kind of person who checked phones or tracked movements, but his behavior changed slowly. He stopped explaining where he went. He started taking calls outside, and he avoided simple conversations like they were a problem he did not want to deal with. Instead of confronting him, I decided to watch and gather details. I needed something solid that I could trust. I started writing down times and places, and I built a routine around his routine without telling anyone what I was doing. By the time I realized how far I had gone, I was already following him across the city, trying to confirm something I could no longer ignore. He always left early on Thursdays, and the pattern never changed. I needed to follow him more than once to understand what he was hiding. The first time I followed him, I stayed back and watched him enter an area that did not match anything he had ever mentioned, and I did not get close enough to see what he actually did. I told myself I needed to be more prepared next time. The second time, I arrived earlier and parked far enough away to avoid being seen, because I needed a clear view without putting myself in danger too quickly. But what I saw forced me to rethink everything in a way I was not ready for. I stayed in the car and waited, because moving too soon would have made it harder to understand what was happening, and I needed to see enough to make a decision I would not regret later. I kept my eyes on the street and stayed still inside the car because I needed to be sure I was not missing anything important before acting. The place was too quiet, and that made every small movement easier to notice. When he appeared, I immediately saw that he was not alone, and the way he held the woman with him showed control instead of familiarity. She tried to slow down and pull back, but he tightened his grip and forced her forward in a way that made it clear she was not there by choice. Before I moved, I stayed in place for a few seconds and forced myself to accept what I had just seen, because reacting without thinking would not help anyone. The situation was already serious, and I needed to act carefully. I got out of the car and moved closer, keeping my steps steady and controlled, because I did not want to draw attention before I understood more. He dragged her to the house and forced the door open, and she stumbled inside while trying to resist, and then the door shut in a way that cut off any sound. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, and I listened carefully because I needed to know what was happening inside before making a decision. I heard something being dragged across the floor, and the sound confirmed that this was not something I could ignore or explain away. I stayed at the door for a moment and kept listening, because entering without thinking could make things worse instead of better, and I needed to be sure I was not walking into something I could not handle. The sounds inside continued, and there were weak attempts at movement that suggested someone was still conscious. When I opened the door, I did it slowly to avoid making noise, and the smell that came from inside made it hard to stay focused because it was strong and unpleasant in a way that suggested something had been left there for too long. I stepped inside anyway, because leaving at that point was not an option. The room looked abandoned. I moved forward carefully and checked each direction, because I expected him to return at any moment. Before going further, I stopped and listened again, because the sounds from deeper inside the house were still there, and they gave me a direction to follow. I followed the hallway and noticed a side room with a door that was not fully closed, and something about that detail made me stop before continuing. Inside, there was a table covered with papers that looked organized. I stepped inside and looked closer, and the pages described how to handle parts of a human body in a way that showed planning and repetition, and that detail forced me to understand what I was dealing with. I stayed in that room longer than I should have, because my mind needed time to process what I was seeing, and I had to decide if I was going to continue or leave. A sound from the other room forced me to move again, because it was clear someone was still alive and needed help, and that fact made hesitation feel wrong. I stepped out and moved toward the source, keeping my movements controlled. The kitchen was dim, and the woman was on the floor with her hands tied behind her back and her legs restrained, and the condition she was in showed she had been struggling for a long time. She looked at me with fear and confusion, and she tried to speak even though her voice was weak. I checked the room quickly to make sure he was not there, and when I realized he had left, I moved closer and started working on the knots that held her. The rope was tight and difficult to undo, and it required steady effort to loosen without making noise. Before I finished, I noticed the refrigerator door was not fully closed, and I opened it slightly because I needed to confirm what I already suspected. Inside, there were stored pieces of human bodies arranged in a way that showed this had been done more than once. I closed it and focused on freeing her, because staying there longer increased the risk, without helping her more. When the rope came loose, I helped her sit up and tried to get her steady enough to move. Before we moved, I stopped and listened, because I needed to be sure we were not walking into him without warning, and the silence made it hard to judge how much time we had. I supported her as we started moving, because she could not walk on her own. We reached the hallway slowly, and each step felt louder than it should, because the house carried sound in a way that made it easy to imagine it reaching the front door. When we were halfway there, we heard a car door close outside, and that confirmed he had returned. I had to decide quickly, and I pulled her into the side room with the table, because it was the closest place that offered any cover. We stayed still as he entered the house, and his footsteps moved through the rooms with a steady pace that showed he was not rushing. He stopped outside the door where we were hiding, and the handle moved slightly as if he was testing it, and that moment forced me to hold her in place to prevent any movement. The pause lasted long enough to feel deliberate, and then he moved away toward the kitchen. I used that moment to act, because waiting longer would only increase the risk, and I opened the door and moved quickly toward the exit while supporting her. We did not try to stay quiet anymore because speed mattered more. We reached the front door and got outside, and I guided her to the car while trying to keep control. When I looked back, he was standing in the doorway watching us. The police confirmed everything we found. The house contained clear evidence of what had been happening, and there was no way to explain it as anything else. The setup showed planning, and it showed that this had been going on for a long time. He was gone by the time they arrived, and the search that followed did not find him, which meant he had time to leave before anyone could stop him. I had to explain my life with him in detail, and that process made me realize how much I had ignored without understanding what it meant. The signs were there, but they did not form a clear picture until it was too late. And as for the woman, she survived. We did not stay in contact, but knowing she was alive made it easier to accept what happened. Alexander Spasivtsev was a serial killer who lured young women and girls into his apartment, where he kept them captive, tortured them, and eventually killed them. He practiced cannibalism, cooking and eating parts of their bodies while continuing to bring in new victims. He was eventually arrested after one victim managed to escape and alert authorities.
He stalked me for the past 11 years and locked me in a bunker, inspired by his favorite TV show, You. I was 20 years old at the time, and I was studying social work. Part of my routine included a small religious group where people met twice a week to talk about their lives, and that is where I met him. He was quiet, always sitting across from me, listening more than speaking. The messages started slowly and seemed harmless at first, because they referred to things I had said during the meetings, and I answered a few times out of politeness, not realizing that responding at all would make him think he had access to me. The messages became constant, and they stopped following any normal pattern, because they arrived at all hours, and if I didn't answer, he would send another one asking where I was or what I was doing, which started to feel invasive. He asked me out several times, and I refused clearly every time. But instead of stopping, he began showing up in places where I'd never seen him before, like outside my classes or near my workplace, standing at a distance and watching without approaching. At first, I tried to explain it as coincidence, but that stopped making sense when I started seeing him too often in places that did not connect, which made it clear he was following me, even though I'd never shared my schedule. I didn't tell anyone right away because I thought I could manage it, but I started changing my routine without thinking, like taking different routes and leaving early just to avoid crossing paths with him again. The situation became impossible to ignore when I realized he was not just messaging me. He was studying me and learning my habits. One night I checked my social media and saw he had gone through years of my posts, leaving comments on old photos. You smiled more back then. You trusted people you should not trust. I blocked him immediately, but the next day I received a message from a different number, and the tone was no longer polite. The tension followed me everywhere, even in crowded places, trying to find him before he could get too close. One afternoon, I got on a bus I rarely used, hoping that changing my routine would help. But halfway through the ride, I saw him sitting behind me, and the way he stayed still made it clear he had been watching me the entire time. I got off earlier than planned, and he followed at the same steady pace, keeping enough distance to avoid confrontation, but staying close enough that I could hear his steps behind me. Weeks passed, and instead of stopping, he made it easier for himself by enrolling in the same academic program I was in, which meant he now had a reason to be near me without hiding it. He sat in the back of the classroom watching constantly, never speaking to me directly. Everything became undeniable when I found a tracker attached under my car, because it confirmed he had been following my exact movements without me knowing. I removed it and held it in my hand, trying to understand how long it had been there, and how many places I had gone to while he knew exactly where I was. But the next message arrived quickly, and it proved I had not changed anything. I am always near. I began carrying a small knife. I needed something that made me feel less exposed. The night everything escalated felt wrong from the beginning, because there were no messages, no signs, and no indication of his presence. I checked the locks multiple times and kept the lights on, trying to reduce the number of blind spots, and I stayed awake longer than usual because I didn't trust the quiet. The silence continued for hours, and instead of calming me down, it made me more alert, because it felt intentional, like he had decided to stop communicating for a reason. I went to the kitchen to get water, and that was when I noticed the bedroom door slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it earlier. And that detail immediately changed the way I moved. I approached slowly, without making noise, and when I pushed the door open, he was already inside, standing near the bed and watching me like he had been waiting. I tried to step back, but he moved quickly and grabbed my arm, pulling me forward and forcing me to the floor before I could reach the knife in my pocket. He pinned my wrist down with enough force to stop me from moving, and when I tried to twist away, he adjusted his position and pressed his weight down, making it impossible to get free. His hand tightened around my neck slowly, controlling my breathing instead of cutting it off immediately, and that control made it clear he had planned for this moment. My attempts to push him away became weaker as my breathing became uneven, and I couldn't change what was happening before everything went dark. The tension returned the moment I woke up. I was no longer in my apartment, and everything around me was unfamiliar. My hands and legs were tied, and I was in the back of a moving vehicle while he drove in silence, and every movement caused pain that made it difficult to stay focused. When the vehicle stopped, he carried me into a building, and the brief glimpse I saw showed concrete walls and storage shelves, which suggested it was not a place anyone would check. When I fully woke up, I was in a small enclosed room with padded walls and a mattress, and the setup made it clear this space had been prepared in advance. He sat across from me and explained his plan in a calm and structured way, describing how he intended to keep me there and how he would make people believe I had disappeared on my own. "I'll leave your phone near the lake. People will assume what happened. This is better. You don't need anyone else." He showed me photos and videos he had collected over the years, and the amount of material proved this had been planned for a long time. The tension increased when he moved closer, because he acted like this situation was normal and expected me to accept it. I changed my approach completely, because resisting physically was not possible, so I started responding calmly and telling him what he needed to hear, even though it went against my instincts. I focused on his fear of prison, which he mentioned more than once, and I used that to convince him that I would never report him if he let me go. "I won't tell anyone. I understand. I can keep this private." He hesitated, and that hesitation gave me a small chance. So I kept repeating the same idea until it became something he could accept. He eventually untied me, partially, and agreed to take me back. But before leaving, he made it clear that there were conditions. He returned me to my apartment and stood near the door, watching me before speaking again with a controlled tone. "If you lie, I will come back." Then he left. I stayed on the floor for a long time after he left, trying to understand how close I'd been to never leaving that place at all, and how easily everything could have ended differently. My body hurt and the marks were visible, but the physical damage was not what stayed with me the most. The tension did not disappear after I reported everything, because even though he was arrested quickly and the evidence was overwhelming, the awareness of how much control he had over my life remained. He claimed it was a role play, based on the TV show You, that went too far. I know it's a complete lie, but he's already paying for all the harm he caused me, and he'll keep paying for the rest of his life. Samantha Stites met Christopher Thomas through a religious group and initially saw him as just another member. Over time, his behavior escalated into a disturbing obsession that lasted more than a decade. For 11 years, he stalked her relentlessly, ultimately kidnapping her in a bunker he had constructed, reportedly inspired by the series You.